So, let's talk about the US and Venezuela. It's this super complex, decades long conflict, right? And while it looks like it's all about politics and power, if you dig down, it's really a fight over one single critical thing.
To really get this, let's start with this quote. It's a pretty heavy accusation from the Venezuelan government, and this one line, it tells you everything you need to know about how they see this fight. For them, it's a high-stakes battle for their own sovereignty and, of course, their incredible natural wealth. So, what's happening right now? Well, things are tense, to put it mildly. The U.S. has hit Venezuela's oil industry with some absolutely crippling sanctions. We're talking about intercepting and even seizing oil tankers on the high seas. And on top of that, there have been some very direct political threats made against President Nicolás Maduro's government.
You know, the crazy thing is, this whole relationship, the good times and the bad, it's all built on a foundation of oil. It's the one thing that brought them together, and now it's the very thing tearing them apart. And to really understand why, you've got to appreciate just how massive the stakes are.
And boom, here it is. This is the heart of the matter. We're not talking top 10 or even top 5. Venezuela is number 1. They are sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. Think about that. That incredible wealth is the prize everyone is playing for on this giant geopolitical chessboard.
And for a really long time, this all worked out pretty well for both sides. U.S. companies had almost total freedom to operate in Venezuela's oil fields. It was a solid partnership. But then, one election came along and completely flipped the script.
And that brings us to this guy, Hugo Chávez. When he was elected back in '99, it wasn't just a new president taking office. No, it was a full-blown ideological revolution that turned the entire U.S.-Venezuela relationship on its head. Yeah, you can really see on this timeline just how methodically things changed. Before '99, everything was pretty stable. Then Chavez comes in, bringing this socialist, very anti-U.S. ideology. First thing he does, he nationalizes the oil industry, basically kicking out U.S. corporate control. And to really seal the deal, he starts making friends with America's biggest rivals. We're talking Russia, China, and Cuba. He completely changed Venezuela's place in the world.
So after Chavez died, his successor, Nicolás Maduro, takes over in 2013. And if you thought things were tense before, well, Maduro basically doubled down on the anti-US position. The conflict just escalated like crazy. It went from a war of words to straight-up economic warfare, and that's when the US sanctions really kicked in.
So you gotta ask, why the sanctions? And this is where you get two totally different stories. The official US line is that it's all about protecting human rights and bringing back democracy. But if you ask Venezuela, they say that's just a cover story. They argue the real goal is to wreck their economy, force regime change, and, you guessed it, get U.S. control over their oil again.
And from Venezuela's perspective, this isn't some new, unique strategy. They look at this and say, we've seen this movie before. They see it as a tested model, a playbook the U.S. has used in other places. They'll point to countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and say it's the same 3 steps. First, you cite human rights issues. Second, you hit them with crippling sanctions, and third, you make a move to control their resources. This is where the source material brings up a really interesting point about consistency. It basically asks, what about other countries? It points out that some close U.S. allies, think Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, aren't exactly democracies and have their own documented human rights problems, but they don't face sanctions. And the reason the source gives for this? They sell oil cheaply to the U.S. The implication is pretty clear. Maybe it's more about oil access than it is about democracy.
Okay, so just when you think you've got this figured out, the plot thickens. This isn't just a US versus Venezuela story anymore. As that relationship fell apart, it created a kind of power vacuum, and 2 other global players were more than happy to jump in, Russia and China. And their involvement has completely changed the game.
And the support they're giving is absolutely critical for Maduro's government. Russia is supplying military gear and, just as importantly, diplomatic protection on the world stage. China, on the other hand, is the economic lifeline. They're doing these huge oil for loan deals. Basically, China gives Venezuela cash now, and Venezuela pays it back later with oil. It's what's keeping the government from going completely broke. Without Russia and China, Venezuela would be totally on its own.
All right, so we've been talking about all this high-level stuff, geopolitics, sanctions, big power plays, but let's bring it back down to earth for a second. What does all this actually mean for the people living in Venezuela day to day? Because, while the governments are playing this big chess game, it's the ordinary citizens who have to deal with the fallout. And the reality on the ground is just
devastating. The economic chaos has created a massive humanitarian crisis. I mean, we're talking about out-of-control hyperinflation, where money becomes practically worthless overnight. At one point, prices were doubling every few weeks, and that means critical shortages of the most basic things you can imagine, like food and medicine.
So who's to blame for all this suffering? Well, surprise, surprise, we have two completely opposite answers. The U.S. and its allies point the finger directly at Maduro's government, saying it's all their corruption and terrible economic policies. But Venezuela and its allies, they fire right back. They say this crisis is the direct, intended result of the U.S. economic blockade, that it was designed to make the country fail. And that really brings us to the final question here. When you strip away all the politics, all the finger-pointing, what you're left with is a country that has the most oil wealth in the entire world, yet its people are suffering terribly. So it really makes you wonder, in this big game of global power between the US, Venezuela, Russia, and China, who is paying the real price?